Some of the folks that I know that have been in conversation with me about my book, The Power Manual, who are using it in their organizations. I mean, one of the things I've heard back almost consistently is that and I talk about this in the book, that there's work on both sides. There's work stepping into power, and there's work in stepping back and kind of sharing power, or like not taking all the power. And people are saying that there was actually like not a lot of language for how people, especially people of color, women, step into power. That was actually like the hardest thing to do because of the associations with it, the lack of comfort with it, how to do it well, just language and like space to even think about that. So I think that this idea of what's dangerous undergirds a lot of these things, even though they seem really, people think about infrastructure and forms as like sterile things. People are like, oh, you're going to have a conversation about infrastructure and forms. Like, who goes to that? But like when you say dangerous, that kind of like, hints at something more. So I want to explore that idea for a little bit before we keep, opening up in a few for questions, but kind of, anything about that, the idea that this is dangerous.
Definitely. I mean, I feel like it's one of the things that in the arts we have as part of our stable of things we can do, which is to say we're allowed to think crazy thoughts, right? We're allowed to think things that don't exist or that aren't practical. We can go to these imaginary places that don't hurt anybody just in order to think that thought, right? But I do think that our overriding, such an overriding question at the moment I think it's the most important question is justice, right? So I don't want to feed injustice that feels like a different kind of danger, right? So there's the danger of doing something idealistic or, kind of crazy talk that I'm up for and I'm used to. But then the danger of like, is something I say going to feed into consolidating injustices or keeping people oppressed or exploited, right? So maybe two different dangers, and hierarchy sounds like it's going to go to the injustice side, but I actually want to think it in a way that it doesn't, right? That we can find the things in it that don't go there, but that scare us because we're so used to thinking about that as the form of injustice.
I want to invite Gibran, who I think mentioned the idea of dangerous thoughts. What were you thinking about when you said that? Because I think you might have a different take.
Thank you. Thank you both, for all three of you, for hosting this. This is awesome. I think what I heard was, I think the fear that we have, whether we're conscious of it or not, is of stepping outside of the bounds of what are thinkable thoughts. So Cyndi mentioned the ideological forms that bind so-called movement think together. And when you speak about hierarchy, I appreciate the kindness with which you bring it, which is you don't want to perpetrate something that creates injustice. I think that's good thinking. But I imagine that for most of us, what is also there is actually a fear of breaking with a dogma, because we know what can happen to us when we do. And I think there's a whole lot of unthinkable thought right now. I think the parameters of what we can think about are too tightly defined, and they get shut down because of the very possibility that they can point in a dangerous direction. And so for example, when I heard you talk about hierarchy, I was aware of the confusion that we have between domination hierarchies and nested developmental hierarchies. Each one of us can think of a different stage in our lives when we thought differently, and we looked at the world differently. And if we saw that person walk into the room right now, we would recognize them, but they wouldn't recognize us in the same way, right? Because somehow we have integrated who we were into who we are. We've gained subaltitude. We can see more than we could see then. And so we each have that lived experience. So we know what a nested developmental hierarchy looks and feels like, but we can speak of it. And so we deprive ourselves of developing building tracks for that kind of development.
Oh, that's beautiful. Very clearly differentiated. What do you have a kind of like a disciplinary home for that thought about the difference between developmental hierarchies and domination hierarchies? Does that come from a particular? It's super interesting to me.
No, well, I mean, I think I've studied a lot of thought around like spiritual evolution, right? And so that's a space that often wrestles with, if we have a cultural meme where you can't draw hierarchies, then you actually can't even speak of truth. And so that was all good when it was us throwing stones at the established buildings, but it's a lot less fun when the right is questioning the regimes of truth. It's a lot less, now it starts to feel scary to us. And so I feel like being able to say, wait a minute, this is true and that is not, is a powerful assertion.
That seems so important right at this moment when expertise is one of the things that's on in question, right? Because that's a kind of, if you say I know more about public health than you do because I'm an epidemiologist, of course I'm not.
Right.
I'm just, getting in that voice for a moment, and you say you're not better than I am, right? I can say whether I wear a mask or not, right? That's an example of this kind of like,
exactly.
Maybe we do want more to have more. Yeah.
And it's quite complex. I'll stop speaking after this, but it's quite complex because I think about it when it comes to like the dangers, like liberalism, right? The Western liberal thought is shaking right now, and that feels scary in many ways because we don't have a space for debate. At the same time, we know that Western liberal thought, the norm, right, the center is whiteness. So there is complexity, right? There is all kinds of ways in which that which is determined expert or master is aligned with whiteness. But then do we say that I can't know more about something than somebody else, or that because I have practiced it, because I've looked at it, because I devoted life force to getting better at it? I feel like you lose too much when you lose developmental hierarchies, which I think what Cyndi was saying about the capacity to hold greater levels of complexity is it, because you integrate and include what was before into what is now, which is the shape of evolution.
And it's also the idea that you can have mastery, right? Then, which brings us into ideas of powerfulness and powerlessness, right? And changes just how social change is even done. In developing the Edge platform, the Edge leadership platform, which we're on, that's been a source, right? Because it was designed for it's a liberatory space. That's what people wanted. And, what happens is when you don't have a space like that and you start one, you have to learn how to be in that space, right? So then how do you start to call out what behavior is being, and how do you even call it out? If you don't want to be using any of the systems that perpetuate what you're trying to get away from, how do you incentivize, for example, rather than, have rules? And then even still, when do you draw a boundary because it's actually hurting the purpose of this form? How do you create a form for liberation and then protect it? And in trying to do that, I found that it is actually, again, going back to the arts, it's more of a curatorial leadership, right? And it's a very new concept. People don't know what it is. People expect collective leadership right now. And people are very suspicious of anything that isn't a neutral leader bringing people together. So this idea that you might be an edge person trying to develop something amazing and that you need a space and you can define and protect and also invite people in with you to build is actually something that a bunch of us are in a group globally talking about, because it's like what we are struggling with. And it's a different form of leadership that seeks to make these things explicit. It gets really personal, right? Because it's about how people show up. And so that all rings and really gets into this place of, I didn't expect the conversation to go there, but hierarchy and mastery. And then what does it do when we close off the idea that we have a responsibility to ourselves to develop, right? That while we're changing social conditions, we are also in this as people developing,